Where is the U.S.-Israeli relationship in 10 years?
I'm more worried about where Israel is going to be at 75.
But when I look at the relationship, I look at it the way I look at the stock market. There are always ups and downs.
Welcome to our Center for Israel Education webinar, U.S.-Israel Relations 75 Years and On. I'm Ken Stein, the CIE President and Professor Emeritus of Emory University. Our two very fine guests, Raphael Danziger and Aaron Miller, are experienced and knowledgeable individuals who have been associated with building the relationship and understanding the differences and compatibilities that exist within that relationship. This webinar is one of several that the Center for Israel Education will sponsor over the next 8 months. If you enjoyed this program and want to help us produce more of them, please visit our homepage and donate to Israel at 75. Our next webinar will be December 15th at 1 p.m. We'll discuss the Palestinian-Israeli issue 1945-1949. Why was that a critical period? The U.S.-Israeli relationship has had at least two major elements. The first is the state-to-state relationship dealing with policies and politics, relationships, personalities, presidents, and prime ministers. That will be our focus today. The second is the individual relationship which non-Jews and Jews have with the state of Israel, how that state of Israel has had an impact on their personal and religious identities, and how does Israel as a state provide Americans with a consciousness of why Israel is important to them. It affects communal identity and sometimes disagreement as well. But that's not our focus today. Today, November 29th, marks the 75th anniversary of the United Nations vote to partition Palestine into Arab and Jewish states and to create an independent regime for Jerusalem and an economic regime between the two new states. It should be noted that both new states were also asked to create constitutions for how they would be run. Severe division occurred when the partition resolution was passed. Zionists were jubilant, Arab states and Palestinians were livid, and the American government was divided on whether a Jewish state in the Middle East was or was not in the U.S. national interest. While eventually the U.S. was the first country to recognize Israel's legitimacy, no Arab state emerged from the partition resolution, and Palestinian agency, the Palestinian right to speak for themselves, was usurped by other Arab states in 47 through 49. Palestinian-Israeli direct negotiations only began in earnest 45 years later, in the late 80s and the early 1990s. From the establishment of Israel in 48 through the 70s and to the present, Israel passed from very cool, suspect, and being a distant friend to one that was a warm ally, a strategic partner. The relationship constantly tested the intellectual, philosophical, and strategic ties that entwined the relationship. There were, I believe, 14 Israeli prime ministers and 14 U.S. presidents who helped evolve the relationship, sometimes with extraordinary closeness and sometimes with equal distance. The U.S.-Israeli relationship is complicated, dynamic, multidimensional, and enduring. Dennis Ross's book, Doomed to Succeed, said it's really difficult, but it continues. Samuel Lewis, U.S. ambassador to Israel, said the relationship exists like the marriage of old. You can love each other for a period of time, but you don't get a divorce. It is deeper and wider than government to government. It is unique among all our relationships in the world. Ups and downs in the relationship are the norm. There's no written treaty between the countries, but rather understandings, letters of assurances, memorandums of agreement, economic aid and technology support, weapon supply assurances, intelligence analysis and sharing, and the United Nations and in other international organizations where the world imbalance against Israel is sometimes toxic, the Israelis and their government look to the United States for support. Let's get to the expertise of our guests, Aaron Miller and Rafi Danziger. To begin with, Rafi, how did you get involved in Middle East issues? How did you get involved in AIPAC and Israel?
Before I talk about myself, let me just tell you how delighted and honored I am to be on this panel. Ken, whom I've known for decades, is probably the most important, the best teacher of teachers and professors about Israel. He's doing a fantastic job. And Aaron, of course, is very well known for his work on the peace process and other Middle Eastern issues. And not only that, he's also today one of the most astute observers of what's going on in the Middle East, including Israel and the Palestinians. My interest in the Middle East began in high school. In Israeli high schools, you choose which direction you want to go. I decided to go in the direction of Middle East. I studied intensive Arabic and the Middle East, and I've been hooked ever since on the Middle East. I became much more involved in Israeli American issues when I first came to the University of Washington in Seattle in 1968. And I was involved in debates with Arabs and I give talks about those issues. And then it's continued in Princeton. Of course, when I joined AIPAC in 1990, that has been really the center of my professional life. I loved every moment of it because AIPAC, as you probably know, has one goal in life, which is to enhance the U.S. Israel relationship. And those are the two countries I love, the United States and Israel.
Aaron, give us a little brief background of how you got into this.
I don't like to be referred to as a scholar because I'm not sure most of my work remotely resembles serious scholarship, the kind that you do. But you've done seminal work on Israel-Palestine, and we've known each other for decades, and it's an honor to be here with you. Rafi, I can say, is capable of incredible detachment as well as advocacy, and I think that's a rare combination to be able to look at a situation with passion and devotion and to campaign and lobby for a strong U.S.-Israeli relationship, and yet I think has a critical sensibility as well, and the capacity to step back and look at the world often not just the way we all want it to be, but the way it is. And it's an honor and privilege for me to be here with both of you. I was on my way to getting a master's degree in Civil War history at the University of Michigan. I ran into two professors, Gerald Linderman, who was a professor of Americans at War, and Richard Mitchell, who wrote the authoritative book on the Muslim Brotherhood. And the two of them came to the university after they had government experience, and both regaled me with stories of distant lands. Jerry Linderman opened the American consulate in Kaduna. Dick Mitchell was out in the Middle East doing all kinds of things for various agencies, I suspect, but they told stories, practical engagement. And I thought to myself, I needed to somehow get into a field that was dynamic and living. So I convinced my doctoral committee that if I passed 3 new fields and could learn Arabic and Hebrew, at least to pass the language exams, would they let me simply switch course? They agreed. Lindsay and I were married in May of '73, packed up a couple hundred books and moved to the only city in the world in 1973, the only one, I believe, where you could actually study Arabic and Hebrew as living languages. It was extraordinary, Hebrew University, but several months later, the October War broke out. And all of a sudden, everything changed. We'd never been in a society geared for war. That was an extraordinary experience. But more than that, began to dawn on me that rather than study history, maybe I could play a part in the history itself, a small part. So I came back, University of Michigan, wrote a dissertation on U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia, which became my first book, and moved to Washington, where I was employed for a couple of years as a historian, editing the foreign relations volumes, and doing histories for very busy policymakers. I was offered an opportunity to become an intelligence analyst following Lebanon and the PLO, 1980 to 83. Those were extraordinary years. My first exposure to the real State Department. Israel invaded Lebanon in June of '82. Everything fundamentally changed. briefing the Secretary of State and other principals, began to understand the complexity of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Roughly 1989 to 2003, when I left the Department of State, I was involved in most of our efforts, unsuccessful though they were, to promote Arab-Israeli peace. I spent the last 22 years in the public conversation trying to figure out what we did wrong, beginning with my own analysis, and to try to create a new baseline of reality toward this conflict. One last point. Before we went to Camp David, we briefed Clinton twice. And during the second briefing, he said to us, trying and failing is better than not having tried at all. And I remember how inspired I was. But the more I thought about it, particularly as we went to Camp David, the more I understood that, with all due respect to the president and Hillary, who both have used that line, and I understand it's quintessentially American, but it's more appropriate, frankly, for the University of Michigan football team than a substitute for the foreign policy of the most consequential nation. Failure hurts, and repeated failure undermines the credibility of a great power.
67 was a major turning point, maybe a benchmark in Middle Eastern history. It changed the way Israelis felt about themselves. It changed the geographic and spatial dimensions of the area around Israel, the geography. It began the end of Pan-Arabism. Maybe it started a little bit before, but when Sadat came to power and replaced Nasser, national interests seemed to be more important than ideological interests. And Sadat's goal was to restore Egyptian honor and get back Sinai. The same motivation for the Abraham Accords in 2020. National interests were more important than ideological interests. In 1967, Israel before May or before June was in a very precarious state. After 67, it was not. The United States acted lukewarm toward Israel prior to the war, and after the war, Lyndon Johnson essentially said, if Israel is going to give back Sinai like it did in 56, Israel should receive something in return, a piece of paper, recognition, a treaty, something like that. And that's how the Americans got deeply involved in Arab-Israeli negotiations. It was Lyndon Johnson's key decision in June of 1967. Americans didn't really get involved until the early 70s. And by the 1970s, America's relationship with Israel was much, much different than it was in 1947 and 48, when it was very lukewarm and there was definite anti-Semitism in the State Department. But by the mid-70s, after the 1967 war, there was an embrace of the State of Israel. And American Jewry felt heartened, warmed by Israel's success. Rafi, when you joined AIPAC in 1990, already 23 years had passed since the 1967 war. How would you characterize the U.S.-Israeli relationship in the period of time from 67 to 90? What were the drivers of the relationship? What were the elements in the relationship? What made it strong and then become stronger?
When I joined AIPAC in 1990, a few months later came Desert Shield and then Desert Storm, and that totally sucked the air out of the room. Everything that had to do with the Middle East, of course, was dominated by those two major events. And as far as Israel were concerned, I think that Bush 41's success in creating an international coalition to remove Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, and that coalition included also major Arab countries, his main concern was that Israel would get involved too. And that concern increased even more after Saddam Hussein launched 39 Scud missiles into Israel. By the way, at that time I was with my sister near Tel Aviv, and the first two Scuds fell about a mile away from where we were. And so there was a very big concern that Israel, which traditionally has been involved in policy of retaliation, would retaliate as well. And I think that that concern, which could have actually led to the withdrawal of the Arab states from that coalition, which would have been a very major setback for the United States, did not happen because Prime Minister Shamir at the time, despite tremendous pressures from the defense minister and the military, did not retaliate, and therefore Israel did not get involved. Saddam was not able to turn into an Arab-Israeli war, which would have changed everything. And that's one of the major reasons why the coalition survived and why it was such a clear victory, not only of the United States, but of the entire coalition. Going back to your question, until 1967, the United States' relationship with Israel was not that strong because Israel was perceived basically as weak. And I think that as a weak country, which everybody thought would depend totally on American favors, it was not particularly looked favorably by the United States. Going back even before 1967, in 1947, 1948, even though President Truman made the critical decision of, first of all, supporting the partition resolution that you referred to earlier, and the United State of Israel 11 minutes after it was formed. But it was actually the Soviet Union that saved Israel. Stalin saved Israel by ordering Czechoslovakia at the time to send serious military equipment to Israel, which allowed Israel to win the war. Ben-Gurion himself said years later, the Soviet Union saved Israel, not the United States. So that was a very different period from what it became later. Of course, everything changed after a few years when it became clear that Israel was joining the Western pro-American camps. But still, as I said, as a weak country, Israel did not gain much favor in the United States until 1967. With one exception, the book by Leon Uris, Exodus, which then became a movie, a huge bestseller, that really had a very big impact on American public opinion in favor of Israel. But what really changed everything was that in 1967, suddenly Israel, as an American ally, defeated Syria and Egypt, the major proxies of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. Since for the United States during the Cold War, everything was seen through the prism of the Cold War, of containing the Soviet Union, that changed Israel's status overnight, or rather over 6 days. So I think after that, first of all, as you said, there was more enthusiasm, especially in the Jewish community, but even in the United States and even in the West in general. Of course, that has changed since then, but I think that 1967 was a huge turning point.
Aaron, you nodded when Rafi spoke about 90 and the Scuds and America's pleasure that Israel did not retaliate. You were directly involved in helping turn that conflict, along with Secretary Baker, into a podium for discussion between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And one could even argue that maybe out of that flowed the secret talks between Israel and the PLO in 1992 and 93. Aaron, would you recollect for us how Secretary Baker and other members of the State Department were able to transform during that 1 year from January of 91 through October, a willingness of Arab states, or initial unwillingness, to join the United States in what became the Madrid Conference and the multilateral talks?
That's a complicated question, and many people have written about it. I'll answer it, but I just wanted to make one additional point. If you ask me when the U.S.-Israeli relationship fundamentally was changed, I would say it was during the Reagan administration. What you saw during Reagan's presidency was a degree of support, an institutionalization of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. It was during those years that strategic cooperation was born. In 1981, the Joint Political Military Group, the JPMG, was born. Israel became a non-NATO ally during those years. There was a free trade agreement. And partly the value proposition that Israel was a fellow democracy operating in a sea of autocracies, which was extremely important to Ronald Reagan. The value proposition of shared values, and we need to talk about that going forward. But during those years, Reagan, who was very influenced by the images of the liberation of the camps, and Israel, in his view, became a natural partner. And it was during these years that the institutionalization of the relationship occurred. But at the same time, it was during these years triggered by 3 or 4 events. One, Israel's attack on the Iraqi reactor, or Sirik, in 1981. A second, Israel's bombing of PLO headquarters. A third, extending administrative law over the Golan Heights. That Reagan also entered into a series of very tense encounters with Prime Minister Begin. And I think it's important to understand that I would argue it was during the Reagan presidency that both the highs of the U.S.-Israeli relationship were experienced and some of the lows. Remember, Reagan was the first and only president, I'll say it again, the first and only president to actively suspend military assistance to Israel. F-16s initially over their unhappiness, which Reagan was ambivalent about. I think he understood the need for the Israelis once they had acted, but he was angered by the fact that they didn't share this information with the Americans first. His view is that the United States could have done a better job. But the first and only American president to suspend military assistance to the Israelis at least twice during his presidency. If you want a baseline for what the U.S.-Israeli relationship has become, that, in my judgment, was the crucible. Those 8 years were critically important to what we now call the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Strategic cooperation, intelligence cooperation, counterterrorism, R&D, all of that was born during the Reagan administration. The Bush and Baker administration came in. Baker didn't want to get involved. He was warned by Nixon, stay away from the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a dog's lunch. It's going to cause you unending headaches. You're going to end up embroiled with the American Jewish community if you're not careful. And Baker took that to heart. But what allowed, I think, successful diplomacy at Madrid, and let me point out, the last 50 years of the 20th century, there was a war in every decade, 48, 56, 67, 82. The 1990s came and went without an interstate conflict between Israel and the Arabs. And I would argue to you that the reason for that was the image, the reality, the prospects, however unrequited they ended up being, of an Arab-Israeli peace. The fact that Hafiz Assad, the elder, could stay in a negotiation with the Israelis from Madrid until his death in the spring of 2000 after the Geneva summit with President Clinton, without any results, was extraordinary. So Baker ultimately became involved because the United States, as so often is the case, entered the Arab-Israeli arena as a consequence of a trauma. Kissinger and Nixon, trauma of the Yom Kippur War. Baker and Bush, the trauma of Saddam's attack on Kuwait. And the Clinton administration, Oslo Accords in the wake of the first Intifada. So in the spring of 1991, America was admired, feared, and respected. Admired, feared, and respected in a way it has not been since. Bush and Baker had a moment, not just in terms of de-escalating the Cold War with German reunification and the opening with Gorbachev, but they took advantage of the power that the American military had displayed by pushing Saddam out of Kuwait, and the prudence that it displayed by not following Saddam to Baghdad. There was a moment, and we had to persuade Baker to take it. We couldn't get him to go to Israel for the first year and a half of the Bush presidency. He finally went in March of 1991, and therein became the 9 or 10 trips that James Baker drove this process. It was also a period, last point, a realization for me, that with an American president who understood foreign policy, and probably only one of 2 truly consequential secretaries of state since the end of the Second World War, Henry Kissinger being the other, that with Bush and Baker, and even an unwilling Shamir, and a strong Assad, and an Arafat who was at sea, and a King Hussein who had sided with Saddam and needed a way back to the Americans, there was this moment to put together what became the Madrid Peace Conference, which frankly, let's be clear, from Israel's point of view, even though Shamir fell asleep I have a picture of it. It was because of Baker's relationship with Shamir. Despite all the tensions, they made a promise, or Baker said to Shamir, you can do a whole lot of things, but don't lie to me and I won't lie to you. They had this relationship. And whether Shamir came willingly or unwilling to Madrid, he came. And Baker created this proverbial table around which Syria, Jordan, the Saudis indirectly, a joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation with Arafat pulling the strings, ended up providing a great screen for the Oslo negotiations, secret, which frankly were the last serious effort, ended in Camp David in 2000, an ill-advised, ill-conceived, and ill-fated summit that never should have happened. It was those 10 years in which there might have been an opportunity. Not since, I'm afraid. Not since the year 2000.
Rafi, from 1990 forward at AIPAC, what was the view of congressional involvement in making foreign policy? In the 70s, Brzezinski and Carter made it quite public that they wanted to reduce AIPAC's strength on Capitol Hill. And it was in the Reagan administration where the U.S. government agreed to sell AWACS to Saudi Arabia. But one looks very deeply into how that sale began. It began in the last years of the Carter administration. And the Reagan administration sort of passed it through. From your vantage point where you sat in Washington, working for an organization that promoted Israeli security and promoted access to American foreign aid, economic aid for that security, how did you see this negotiating process unfold in a manner that we had not seen before? We hadn't seen Madrid, and we didn't see Oslo, and we didn't see the PLO-Israel Accords, and the United States-Israel relationship remained strong. How was it viewed?
I retired from AIPAC officially 12 years ago. I cannot speak for AIPAC. Everything I say is just in my personal capacity. I would say that, or AIPAC used to say when I was there, that administrations come and go, but the Congress is always there. And the Congress was always seen as a bedrock of support for the U.S.-Israel relationship. There were some obvious leaders in Congress of initiative to strengthen that relationship. I can think of Howard Berman, Lantos, Lieberman, Inouye, etc. But it was much, much broader than those few people who were leaders and deserve tremendous credit for their initiatives. But Congress has been, ever since, very supportive of Israel. And while Congress does not make foreign policy, Congress does control the purse strings. And of course, that is very, very important. And I think that what's most important in the relationship as far as Israel's security is concerned is this tremendous military aid that the United States has provided to Israel. That has been always AIPAC's signature project to make sure that this aid continues and grows to the extent possible. And the idea was that Israel is different from its neighbors because while its neighbors want American troops to defend them, Israel always said, give us the tools and we'll do the job. And I believe it was Reagan who came up with the term QME, which is qualitative military edge, which means that Israel should be able to defend itself by itself against all of its enemies. And I think that that notion was extremely important to Congress, was extremely important to the American people and to administration, that Israel never asked, and I'm sure never will ask, for American troops to defend it. And Congress played a key role in that. And I'm very proud of the role that AIPAC played in making sure that this actually happens, that the Congress will be very supportive. Now, of course, some changes have occurred. Recently, some in the radical wing of the Democratic Party have challenged that relationship, including in the security relationship. But for now, and personally, of course, I hope this will continue, the mainstream Democratic Party, and certainly President Biden, who has been a friend of Israel for decades and really cares about Israel, I think will continue with this policy of making sure that Israel is safe and secure, and with the United States having Israel's back without actually needing to involve American troops in its defense.
I think it's fair to say that without this special relationship with Israel, America would have little influence on the negotiating process and peacemaking?
In my opinion, it's a very fair assumption. I think especially in the State Department, before Aaron's time, of course, the prevailing thinking was that the relation between Israel and the Arab states are a zero-sum game. You support Israel, you lose the Arabs. All of them believed that was the case. And the Arab countries with the oil were much more important to them than little Israel at the time.
Ken, could I just add something to that?
Yeah, you can, because the quotation was taken from your book,
Yeah,
page 79.
let's be clear here. There is something called the special U.S.-Israeli relationship, and there's something called the exclusive U.S.-Israeli relationship. All right? There's a difference between special and exclusive. You had three Americans, and only three Americans, Kissinger, Carter, and Baker, who were able to negotiate what I call in-zone of conflict agreements. In-zone of conflict agreements. The Abraham Accords, as extraordinary as they are not in zone of conflict agreements. They are out of zone conflict agreements. And there's a huge difference. Kissinger, Carter, and Baker, all of them, in my judgment, were they honest brokers or were they effective brokers? I think the trust and confidence of Israel in all three cases was critically important to the success of those negotiations. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. I think pressure was applied at various points in each case. I think that all three negotiations ended up resulting in very difficult and tense relations between the United States and Israel, and a wrangling and wrestling. I was, fortunately or unfortunately, part of the Baker success with the American Jewish community. Nobody's going to plant a tree in your honor if you end up succeeding in Arab-Israeli negotiations. Fighting with Israel, let's call it fighting with Israel and the Arabs, but we're talking now about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, is an occupational hazard. And the fight, in my judgment, is only worthwhile if the stakes are high enough and success is at the end of the road. They all succeeded, but they all succeeded to a certain degree while maintaining a limited amount of independence of American decision-making, all right? I contrast that with the Clinton period. I penned a piece in 2005. I'm blamed for it now, hailed by the left for coining the expression, chastised and worse by many in the Jewish community for even raising the notion that during the Clinton years, not Kissinger, Carter, and Baker, we were, to use Kissinger's phrase, since I got it from his memoirs, I didn't invent the phrase. He talked about being Israel's lawyer. He talked about the fact that we couldn't be Israel's lawyer. During the Clinton administration, in my judgment, we allowed the special relationship in many respects to become exclusive. And we gave up some of the independence of decision-making that would have been critically important to succeed at Camp David. The reason Carter succeeded at Camp David is because Carter controlled the negotiating text. That text, as you know, Ken, went through 23 drafts. The fourth day of the summit, we put a paper on the table. And as was our practice, we showed it to the Israelis first. Barak hated it. Hated it. And Clinton wouldn't, quote unquote, jam Barak and basically go with what we had. We then turned it around and gave it to Arafat. And the Palestinians hated it. So in my view, day 4 of the Camp David Summit of 13, summit was over.
You're speaking about Camp David 2000.
Yeah. 4th day of the summit, Camp David was over. We lost control of the text. We lost control of the negotiation. Now, let me be very clear. There was absolutely, positively no conceivable way that Camp David could have succeeded. The mythology that we were this close to an agreement is just wrong. we were this close to an agreement on every issue: Jerusalem, borders, security, refugees, recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, and end of conflict and all claims. Those 6 issues, we were this close.
Aaron, the only thing I would argue with you or make a point on is it takes leaders with will and courage to step forward. I don't think you would have had a negotiating process in the 70s without Sadat. I'm firmly convinced that Sadat was the key catalyst, because every time the negotiations slowed down, he put his foot on the accelerator, took the car out of neutral, and went to second and third gear.
100% right.
Now, I think at Camp David, one, Carter was lucky he had 2 guys who wanted to make a deal.
And a deal was doable, Ken.
They knew it was doable.
doable.
Yes,
Not-
but the point is they knew it was doable because it was in the respective national interest of the respective parties. My argument to you would be this, and it's not an argument, but it's just a point, that if you went for 10 years without Assad reaching an agreement with the Israelis, and you had Arafat, who was however close or however far away, both of them have to have the will and the courage and to say, yes, I want to reach an agreement. I'm willing to accept Israel or a Jewish state in this neighborhood. If you don't have that unequivocally, like you had it from Sadat, it doesn't matter how strong the U.S. special relationship
Yes,
is.
100%, which is why the summit, had Clinton said to Barack and Arafat, this will be the first of several meetings, okay? That would be one thing. But to go to a make or break deal with 6 months left in the Clinton administration at a high profile summit, let me just say one thing about Sadat. Sadat set the bar, Ken. That was the issue. Sadat got 100%, 100%, and the dismantling of every Jewish settlement in Sinai, okay? And he paid for it with his life. But by saying, I want 100%, he made it almost impossible. Assad wanted more than 100%. That's the problem with Assad. He wanted part of the Kinneret. He wanted 300 meters off the shoreline. He had gone swimming in the Sea of Galilee as a boy. He wanted to be in the water. And Arafat was not going, I know, there's this notion largely within the Jewish community, Arafat was not willing to make a deal because Arafat wanted 100% of the West Bank, maybe minus 1% or 2, and Jerusalem, and a solution to the refugee problem. Barack was heroic at Camp David, no question about it. But there was no way Camp David was going to succeed. We can't produce 100% for Assad. And we couldn't produce 100% of the West Bank and Jerusalem for Arafat. And in many respects, we're all living with the consequences of a problem that simply may not be tractable.
Sam Lewis said that the United States can't want it more than the respective sides, which I think is a great phrase.
I think that, of course, Sadat deserves tremendous credit for making a separate peace with Israel. And he knew he would pay a heavy price with the Arab countries. But at the same time, I think we should not forget what Begin did. Begin, who was very much a hardliner, Begin, who presided over the building of thriving settlements in the Sinai, which also had major Israeli air bases, and was really a very major asset for Israel with oil, etc., that Israel itself discovered. Mm-hmm. Begin made the unbelievably tough decision to give up every inch of the Sinai, including the air bases, including the oil, including everything that was in it. And for that, you need to have a really, really, really strong leader. And I don't know that Israel had a strong leader like Begin.
Well, Aaron confirmed it earlier that leaders matter. Let me finish with 2 questions. The difference between transformations and transactions. Transactions have to do with demilitarized zones and withdrawals and amount of foreign aid and all that stuff that goes on or gets put into an agreement. Transformations have to do with changing the way you see the other and how the other sees you. In your respective views, where we are today, are we only headed for another transaction or a series of transactions between Israel and, let's say, the Palestinians? Or are transformations possible between those two communities?
I'm afraid I don't see a transformational change between Israel and the Palestinians. I do see this change in the relation between the Abraham Accord countries, especially the United Arab Emirates and Israel. This is really, to me, almost a miracle that Israelis go to the United Arab Emirates and treated very, very well. Everybody likes them there, and the relationship is blooming. And this is transformational. Of course, as Aaron said correctly, this is different from having this kind of relationship with countries that were at war with Israel, like Egypt and Jordan. But still, this is quite remarkable. I don't see that happening between Israel and the Palestinians. I don't see any major change here. I don't see a peace process that will be successful for the reason that Aaron outlined, in my opinion, correctly. And I'm afraid I'm quite pessimistic about that. And I hope there will be some at least transactional changes that still may happen. I don't see exactly when and how. It probably will take a long time before this happens. But no, I don't see any transformational changes.
Transformations in life are rare. They're rare in our personal lives. They're rare in the lives of nations. COVID, which was arguably the most planet-altering event since the end of the Second World War. Who knows where we are in the COVID cycle? I thought COVID would fundamentally alter life as we knew it. But you know, COVID hasn't. Millions died, hundreds of thousands were taken ill. But I wonder what's really changed. I think the same thing about Ukraine. So transformations in life are rare. I see no transformations of a positive nature. I see no transactions. And I must say, we're about to enter what I consider to be an unprecedented period in the U.S. Israeli relationship, and for Israelis in the history of their own country. We've just been through 4 years of what I thought would be a democracy-wrecking administration.
You mean here?
Here, June 21st, and last month, there was no storming of the Knesset. There was no election denial. There was no big lie. There were concession speeches by Israeli political leaders and a peaceful transfer of power. We couldn't say the same on January 6th, but there's been a course corrective, maybe. I fear that the state of Israel is about to go through much of what we went through, because I'm stunned when I think about the results of this democratic, extraordinary process, legitimate process, what it has produced.
Let me leave this discussion with the notion that there were only between 20 and 30,000 votes that separated the Israeli left from the Israeli right that were cast in this election, and 71% of the Israeli voters went to the polls. It's the nature of the political system and how it's managed and manipulated by those who control the coalition will determine the outcome. We know that. Like January 6th, I believe then that the institutions were stronger than the individuals who tried to change those institutions. I feel the same way about other democracies, including the state of Israel. You have civil society in that country. You have a judicial system that may take a lot of pressure. My question to you as we finish, where is the U.S.-Israeli relationship in 10 years? We've come 75 years from wariness and uncertainty, and maybe we shouldn't have a Jewish state, into Israel becoming the most prominent, stable, strategic partner that the United States has in the region. How do you see it evolving? From what your experience has shown, where would you say we are when Israel celebrates 85?
Pythia, the oracle at Delphi, reading Best of Godin Trails, could probably not answer your question. I'm more worried about where Israel is going to be at 75, because I look at this current situation. I mean, maybe I'll be proven wrong. Maybe you're right that the institutions of the state will hold, that the independence of the judiciary will not be undermined by Knesset legislation, designed to either cancel or postpone 3 indictments of a sitting prime minister and his trial. But if the trial is postponed or delayed and the judiciary is somehow gutted, I worry, Ken. I worry.
The relationship
Bottom
won't break.
line-
You don't think
bottom
the
line-
relationship is
well,
going to break?
Wait, Ken, let me be clear. The relationship is already framed. The confluence of values and interests that has sustained the U.S.-Israeli relationship and the bipartisan quality, which is absolutely elemental and essential for its resilience on our side. Forget what the Israelis are doing. You have at least 3 views of Israel among American political elites today. You have the Republican Party, which has become, in my judgment, frankly, an Israel right or wrong party. And you have a divided Democratic Party with traditional Democrats who are great proponents of a healthy, resilient U.S.-Israeli relationship, and a minority of younger Democrats who are prepared and want to be much more critical. I would only refer you to 2016, when at least 3 Democratic candidates running for the presidency used the word racism within the same sentence as the current Israeli government. Things are changing here. And it's been my view from the beginning that the reason the United States has supported Israel these many years is not because of the Holocaust, very important. It's not because of Israel as a strategic partner, very important. It's not primarily because of the influence of 6 million, 5.5 million American Jews and millions of evangelicals, very important. The one adhesive and the glue is value affinity. Without value affinity, it becomes the U.S.-Philippine relationship or the U.S.-Panama relationship. My argument to both of you and to your listeners, as I see it, never have I been more concerned about the undermining of that value affinity than I am today. And I think it's going to get worse. Before it gets worse, I'm hoping that, as you put it, the institutions of the state of Israel, leaders, civil society, are able to do what I think we are in the process of doing here, which is creating a course corrective to some degree that'll preserve a liberal, democratic, pluralistic democracy. And I don't want to compare America to Israel. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south and fish to our east and west. I had 2 Israeli prime ministers say the exact same thing to me, Rabin and Netanyahu. You live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Don't you preach to us about your security. We're living on top of a volcano, all right? I don't want to compare them. But the value affinity is breaking down, Ken. It is breaking down.
What I would say is, first of all, I was trained as a historian, and I'm pretty good in predicting the past, not quite as good in predicting the future. I failed many times in the past to predict the future, and I probably will now too. But I would say that as disturbing as some of the characters who are going to be in the Israeli government are, I think that we went through such problems before. When Begin took over in 1977, people thought that Israel is never going to be what it was before. Begin used to be the head of Irgun, which everybody considered a terrorist organization, even the mainstream of the Jewish community in Palestine at the time. So the world did not fall. And then actually the same Begin, who was the head of the Irgun in the 40s, as mentioned before, is the one who gave up the Sinai and made a peace treaty with Egypt, which is still holding today, 42 years later. Shamir, also the head of the so-called Stern Gang in the 40s, also considered an arch terrorist. Then also turns out that he was not really an arch terrorist when he was Prime Minister of Israel. And again, the sky did not fall under Shamir either. So now I think that we have to judge the incoming Israeli government, not by some of the really disturbing statements by some of the people who joined the government, but by the acts of the government, what will it actually do? And I think that Netanyahu still will be prime minister, not Smotrich and not Ben-Gvir. He will make the final decisions. And I think that while he's not exactly a bleeding heart liberal, nobody will claim that, but at the same time, he is a responsible statesman most of the time. And I think he will do what he can to restrain the radicals from doing what they're doing. And in general, when I look at the U.S.-Israel relationship, as Aaron also has articulated so well, there have been major ups and downs. But when I look at the relationship, I look at it the way I look at the stock market. There are always ups and downs. But if you look at the trend over 10, 20, 30 years, it is a trend that's going up. And I believe that we'll overcome that period that will come now. Again, maybe I'm just expressing wishful thinking, but I think that it's quite possible that, like in the past, when there were terrible crises which seemed to end the relationship, and Aaron discussed some of those, and the presidents who really, really hated the guts of the Israeli prime minister they had to deal with, I think that it's possible, and again, all I can say is inshallah, that indeed this will be the case now, that this will blow over, and eventually, like the stock market, the relationship will continue to grow and improve over the coming years.
Let me thank you both for your friendship, collegiality, your intellectual honesty, for being terrifically articulate. I hope our viewers will understand that this is the caliber of webinar that we want to continue to have as we move through 2023. I hope you will visit our website, www.israeled.org, and glean more information about the relationship. There's a theme on the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Lots to read, lots to learn. We've been given a great boost, a great catalytic energizer by Raphael and Aaron tonight. And I profusely thank both of you for a wonderful, wonderful evening. And I'm sure the viewers enjoyed it as well.